Okay, I think we're live, and this isn't going to be an extraordinarily long live stream. Just wanted to give you a few updates on what's happening, at least in New York. The number of confirmed cases for COVID-19, or as I call it, the Wuhan flu, the Chinese Communist Party virus. It's another hashtag that's very popular now. It's probably being censored by Twitter because Twitter is no, I'm still alive. Thank God. Me and my family, we're all still alive. Hi, Enoch. And what was I saying? Yeah, Twitter is basically allowing the Chinese government to promote these conspiracy theories purporting to uncover a plan by the U.S. government to spread the coronavirus. Um, it's kind of it's odd when you look at the fact, and someone pointed this out on Twitter, the fact that political candidates are not allowed to utilize Twitter for their reelection campaign, but somehow the Chinese Communist government is allowed to basically spread whatever bizarre conspiracy they've concocted in order to deflect blame from the fact that they're responsible for unleashing this global plague upon the rest of the world. Hi, Irene. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Matthew. And it's kind of inconsistent, but it makes sense when you look at how companies like Twitter and, well, basically any multinational corporation that has interests in Asia and has a presence in China. You start with the NBA when Adam Silver kowtowed to the Chinese Communist Party because the general manager of the Rockets had made a relatively benign Twitter post supporting the protesters in Hong Kong who were trying to retain some semblance of civil government that wasn't uh, basic liberties that they had enjoyed prior to the arrival of prior to Kong's reincorporation into China proper, the People's Republic of China. Hi, Roxby. And you see this throughout virtually any corporation. Even now, I think in the media there are a couple of stories in the Washington Post that are critical of China. But other than that, the only newspaper you see where people are actually pointing out the fact that China is responsible for this, is responsible for these thousands of deaths and uh, basically the collapse of the American and European economies. The only newspaper that's doing that is the Epoch Times, which has a vested interest in in pointing out how terrible China is, how terrible the Chinese government is. Um, it's kind of interesting if you look at Vox. There's a great Vox explainer which describes why these types of viruses, not just this, but the avian flu, these these viruses that you find in pandemics that spread abroad, why you find them in China. And the main reason is because these wet markets are are sort of an outgrowth of a period in China where the government you had a government created famine. So these were basically from the time Mao took office all the way up through the 1980s, where Deng Xiaoping started to liberalize the economy and allow people to conduct commerce, you had artificially created famines and starvation, and occasionally these would be explosive, like in the Great Leap Forward, where you had where you had where you had the forced relocation of people for agrarian purposes, and you had these collective farms. Hey, Nathaniel. Yes, yeah. Amazon is probably one of the few companies that's actually hiring people at this time. Hi, David. But you had basically a period where people were constantly in danger of starvation. Now, this wasn't novel for China. I mean, you can even reading The Good Earth, you can tell that China has always experienced periods of famine, political unrest, particularly when the Qing dynasty was collapsing, the Manchu dynasty, and you had all of this political upheaval. You had warlords coming in. You had, and eventually they were replaced by the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek and their conflict with the communists. So you always had these periods of intermittent famine and great famine where you would have many people dying. But Mao institutionalized this to the point where you had upwards of 40 million, some say 60 million people die of starvation. Just like in the Soviet Union, when you had the Holodomor or uh, dekulakization policies, you had enforced starvation. And the wet markets, if you trace it back, if you go back far enough, you can trace it to these policies. And what the Chinese government does did or does is they actually inserted themselves into these wet markets um, once you had this economic quasi liberalization. They basically took a cut from all of these wet markets that were selling exotic wildlife for food. And you've seen these pictures, these really kind of gross, grotesque pictures of people uh, of livestock, but also uh, just domesticated animals being sold for food, and things, of course, like bats and pangolins and stuff that virtually no one else eats. And it's interesting because a similar situation occurred in North Korea once the state essentially collapsed, except for the state apparatus concerned with oppressing people and and reinforcing the existing regime. But the actual uh, things like providing food or providing jobs, once that collapsed in the early 90s with the death of Kim Il Sung and the demise of the Soviet Union, and the USSR decide to stop subsidizing them just like they did with Cuba. Once that collapsed, you had people having to scramble to figure out how they would feed themselves, and a lot of them, over a million, wound up dying. And one of the things they did was to set up markets, these informal markets where people could buy and sell food. And this was the first time in North Korea where people could actually engage in a form of capitalism. Um, no, there aren't more. There, there are about. Well, this is an estimation, but I think there are 100 million Christians. There are more Christians in China than there are members of the Communist Party. I think only 90 million. There are 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party out of a population of uh, approximately 1 billion. So there are more Christians than CCP members, but not more Christians in China than the rest of the world. Uh, but it is growing. I mean, that's one of the reasons the Chinese government is cracking down in places, particularly like Chengdu. Um, Particularly places like Chengdu, you have Pastor Wang Yi from Covenant Range Church. His This case attracted a lot of publicity when they put him in prison and shuttered his church. But you have that. Um, but you have that throughout the country. But going back to these markets, you have the same thing happen in North Korea, and in North Korea as well. If you ever read any of these memoirs of people in North Korea who was sent to labor camps, I think they're called Kwan Liso. The Basically a chain of labor camps that are similar in some ways to the Gulag archipelago, or in China they're called Laogai. These labor camps, which most people don't emerge from. There are separate camps that are sort of way stations where they imprison people who flee for economic reasons, and those people are eventually released. But the labor camps, most of the people there die, and in some cases you have multiple generations because they in North Korea you have the system of they have the system of intergenerational uh intergenerational I guess you I guess the best way of describing it is intergenerational sin, according to the North Korean, the Workers' Party. So if you're put in it, they have three classes. One of them is the wavering class, and one of them is the class that comprises most of the rulers of North Korea. But there's another class which is people who are just um, considered beneath contempt, and they usually can't hold any job, um, any real good jobs. They can't pursue their education, and a lot of cases they're imprisoned. But like if you read any of these memoirs from these camps, you see people having to find food by attacking rats and eating rat meat and any sort of animals in addition to vegetation that they can find. They have to eat that in order to survive. So it's very similar to what happened in China, where you have these people eating just all of these weird animals that really aren't fit for human consumption. So that even after even post Mao, where theoretically people are not in danger of starvation, or they could have access to some food that's not part of these, not sold in these markets. It's become institutionalized. So and the government profits from it. So that's one of the reasons the government did not shut the Chinese regime didn't shut them down, even after you've had at least three of these similar epidemics that spread across China's borders. Not as devastating as this one, but still infect and kill thousands of people. So Vox has a pretty good explainer, believe it or not, where they go into this and explain why you have these markets. One of the reasons is because the Chinese government itself profits from it, but also there's a backstory there to why people would be eating these things. Uh, even people who are not indigent. A lot of the people that buy these things are not necessarily the type of Chinese person who would be in danger of not being able to find food or starving. I mean, the migrant laborers, I talked about this in another video, but the migrant laborers in China are are relatively speaking very poor. So I mean, not much has changed for them since The Good Earth, which was written in the early part of the 20th century. There's still millions of Chinese migrant laborers who go into these big cities like Beijing or Harbin or um, or Wuhan. They still go to these places in order to find work, and are basically at subsistence level living. So you do have a lot of that, but even people who are not at in that precarious state go to these markets and buy this food. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about that. I'm gonna read from Zhong Chang's biography of Mao, hopefully in one of my next videos, where I explain the deliberate starvation policy that Mao pursued when he was in charge of China. And it's really fascinating because she delves into this issue, and she describes the internecine fighting that Mao had with other members of the Chinese Communist Party, people like Chao and Lai and others who, even as they realized the Great Leap Forward was causing millions of people to die, Mao resisted doing anything to ameliorate the situation. Like I said in another video, he was kind of a staunch nihilist. He didn't care how many people died. Not only other people, but even Chinese people. Obviously, he didn't care how many of them died, as long as his idea fix was implemented. So as long as his philosophy was paramount, he didn't really care how many people he killed, and he got pushback from the rest of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, who told him that you can't let half of the nation starve. So even though 40 to 60 million starved to death, he literally wanted to wipe out half of the Chinese population. That's how committed he was to this sadistic idea. And Zhong Chang really describes this very vividly. I'm probably going to read from that book in a couple of, maybe in my next video or the video after that. But in terms of the coronavirus, just a brief update. There are 20,000 confirmed cases, and that's half of the entire country. And I think, and this kind of surprised me. I looked at the cases globally. I think it is, I want to say 19% of the number of cases globally, or just in New York. And I think New Jersey too, it has I'm not sure if it's the second highest yet, but it also has a pretty bad, in general, the tri-state area is is faring pretty poorly. They're using the Jacob Javits Center as a makeshift hospital, which is pretty pretty stunning. I don't know how many of you have been to the Jacob Javits Center, but it's basically a gigantic convention center they use for things like Comic-Con, job fairs, just various conventions. They've been trying to replace it for years. This was one of the proposals when they were thinking of building a stadium for the New York Jets on, on along the West Side Highway. But the Jacob Javits Center is huge. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Westies, but they were an Irish gang, a really incompetent Irish gang who tried to along the west side of Manhattan, and try to take a cut of the construction business that happened uh, th- that's tied to the Jacob Javits Center just because it's so lucrative. But they're using that as a hospital now, a kind of a field hospital, I guess. So it's beginning to look like one of these uh, post-apocalyptic mo- movies a little bit. Yeah, the Westies were a strange gang. They the last leader I think was Serbo-Croatian. He wasn't even Irish. T.J. English wrote a good book about them. But yeah, so that's happening, and I in terms of it's it's really interesting. I- there was there was an Olympic swimmer who won, I think, a bronze medal in 2012. So this is a guy who was in peak or was in peak physical condition who got the coronavirus virus, and he says it hurts him to rake leaves now. So and it recovered. So that was an interesting tidbit I came across. There's also I can't pronounce the name, but there's also a new drug that they're or an old drug rather that they're it begins with an R that they're going to try and use to temper the effects of the coronavirus. Other than that, I'm trying to think of what New York is up to. It's actually hi hi George Washington. There's it's actually raining right now in New York. Yeah, not everyone gets the notifications for the streams for some reason. If you look at um, my analytics, it breaks down how many people are watching the video because of notifications, and I think it's less than a quarter. How many of them are watching because they have all notifications on, so I guess they hit the bell so they can be notified whenever these videos come up, and it's less than 30%, I think, combined probably like 40%. So not everyone actually sees these videos. But yeah, so that's an update as far as the coronavirus goes. The mosquito virus, I think you're thinking of West Nile virus. That was pretty prominent. And that was one of those things, it persisted over the course of a couple of years, although it's died down. Initially, it people were very worried about it, and in fact, they sprayed. I think they used Anvil. They had some pesticide that they used that was very toxic at the time. This was under Giuliani, I believe. I mean, the West Nile virus is still around, but this was one of the first times it hit the United States. I think it began in Colorado or barbershops. As far as I know, they're completely closed in New York City. There are no barbershops that are open. I think they also stopped. I'm not sure. I think the governor also ordered restaurants to stop take they can't serve takeout any longer. I could be wrong about that, but I think that also happened. Yeah. Bowl cuts. Yeah, I mean, I don't think cutting your like they're um obviously people can if they're really that desperate, they can probably train themselves to cut their own hair. I mean, there are YouTube tutorials who can tell you as long as you have. I mean, if you have, I guess it depends if you have clippers or not. I mean, what kind of tools you have at your disposal. I mean, some people just have scissors that are good for cutting paper. So, I mean, that probably would not be a good idea to use that to cut your own hair. But yeah, I mean, hopefully this will dissipate to the point where people can get haircuts before the end of the year, hopefully. Uh, I hope so. What do they call? I think they one of the nicknames for that is an ape drape. That Billy Ray Cyrus haircut where you have the long front of you have long hair in front and in the back it's very short. It's funny, someone on Twitter made a joke, and I think this person was from the South. They said if you don't have one of your friends who has their own garage, salon, or barbershop, you're in trouble. Mullet, that's it. That's what I was thinking of. Mullet. The Vandals have the song "I've Got an Ape Drape," and there's some video on YouTube where they just show all these people who look like Billy Ray Cyrus, or all of these people with these amazing mullets. It's kind of funny. Uh, anyway, that's just an update in terms of Corona. Like I said, I'm probably gonna go back and look at that Zheng Chang book because it actually has some interesting things. And there's another book called The Great Influenza, which actually has some interesting insights that could be applied today in terms of the government response and what happened, because that took place a year after the end of World War One, and the Wilson administration did a lot of things that set the table for the flu rampaging across the country. Yeah, I don't know what the statistics are in terms of religious denominations. I know mainline Protestant churches have declined greatly. Evangelicals, I think, have tapered off a little bit, but they're still one of the most prominent in terms of percentages. But anyway, I'm probably gonna read a little bit from those books in the next couple of videos, and update you if anything dramatic happens. But thanks everyone for coming. I really enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.